Hey everyone, welcome to Civil Offense. My name is Ahmed Mlih, and today we're going to be discussing national divorce. So today we have an article by Jonathan Casey, who is the chair of the Classical Liberal Caucus of the Libertarian Party, and he has an article on Learn Liberty that is sponsored by SFL, in which he discusses why national divorce is not a pro-liberty solution. And today we're obviously here to dispute some of the points he's made. We're going to take a look at his article and, talk about it. And today I am joined by Ashton.
It's your boy, Kyle Rittenhouse 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Fair enough. Okay. So I guess just starting off with this, obviously he wants to make the case that national divorce is not the solution because then you'll just be tyrannized by the new forces that arise following it, and that apparently we need to centralize the federal government and keep it that way in order to make sure that liberty prospers. But we'll just go ahead and dive right into his article. But before that, actually, I do want to say on civiloffense.substack.com, I do have my own article related to national divorce, and it's actually called Why National Divorce Would Save America. That's why a national divorce would save America on Civil Offense. You can read that right now. I would encourage you to go to that on Substack, subscribe to it, and subscribe to my own website at ahmedmali.com. So, national divorce is not a pro-liberty solution, according to Jonathan Casey. Fear is the stalwart and eternal ally of tyranny, and sowing division is the surest way to make people afraid. Today, many Americans aren't motivated by a candidate they vote for, but rather fear of the candidate they are opposed to. As politicians push division to gain more power, libertarians should be working to unite Americans against authoritarianism. Division is the fuel that nourishes tyranny. Feeding it will only starve the liberty movement. So, just looking at that,
there's a lot to say there.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that he says unite Americans against authoritarianism. My big thing when I saw that was, okay, you do want a coalition with people who you will agree with on certain things. Like, there's the whole phrase of working with anybody to do the right thing, but
sort of like Big Tent idea.
Yeah, right. But to say that you could just end the culture war that way, like that you could just somehow separate people from these fundamental values that they have, because that is sort of on a wider scale SFL's position on this, that the culture war is not conducive to liberty, and that essentially fighting it in any way, participating in it in any way is essentially antithetical to liberty. But his point is that you can unite Americans against authoritarianism, and I would assume that he means also by sort of getting them to drop some of their cultural values in order to, or at least put them to the side in order to make changes to policy. But to me, it just seems like the right and the left aren't there on that you can't just bring them to this endpoint immediately and just say, okay, let's fight the government now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, I want to be as charitable as possible to this guy. I get where he's coming from to a degree, where it's just like, if we just stick to this strategy, like we have this strategy laid out, where we could just unite Americans, if we just educate enough people, and that they'll get on our side. But the problem is, it's not like that hasn't been tried before. The LP National has been doing that for decades, and they've failed each and every time. They put up the milquetoast candidates, like, to where, okay, you got like a little bit percent of the vote, you got like the people who do care, but hasn't done shit, hasn't done anything good, and they've totally and utterly failed in that.
And then when the LP actually gets close to a libertarian message, then they start complaining.
Yeah,
like as soon as the party's like, yeah, we do need some sort of solution, they're like, no, we need a state, we need democracy, we need to impose this all on people. Like, that's not how you're going to get to a liberty society.
And then when you get some place getting a little spicy with it, like a Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, when they get a little bit spicy with their messaging in a way that does provoke a great reaction to it, they just try to appease the establishment, and that, like, you have this journalistic class that is for some reason in defense of John McCain when they hated him in the 2008 cycle and whatnot, and then they're just like, there's so many things to say, but it's just like trying to narrow it down to a concise message of, these people will hate us if we are effective. Them hating us now is no reason to stop what we're doing.
Yeah. So as he goes on to say, Talk of national divorce, he puts it in quotes, has grown as Americans are being driven apart by political wedge issues designed to keep them afraid of the other. The opportunity for libertarians in this moment is not to celebrate divisions, but rather to remind Americans of the principles that inspired the creation of a government. These allow people to of vastly different beliefs to coexist peacefully together. It's time for a broader discussion about why national divorce is not a pro-liberty solution. Fundamentally, for any change in the structure of government to be pro-liberty, it must move us towards more individual liberty, not away. So on that, though, the middle paragraph is something that I wanted to point out, talking about reminding Americans of the principles that inspired the creation of a government. It just seems like, the federal, well, it doesn't just seem like it. I mean, the federal government is not incentivized to protect the natural rights, even the ones laid out in the Bill of Rights, if you want to go based on that. And if you want to discuss, the creation of a government, this is just holding on to the idea that the idea of a state rather than the idea that was laid out in the founding, before the Constitution. It just seems more so like there's this idea that, yeah, if we just enforce the Constitution, then we get to liberty and that's it. Right. And talking about allowing people of vastly different beliefs to coexist peacefully together. If I were to refute this, I would say, if anything, why is them all living under the same system conducive to liberty? Why is sending people from vastly different beliefs, systems, and from different states in which that takes place into one building to discuss these things and debate these things gonna help us?
Precisely, and I want to jump on that specifically in his first statement of just being driven apart by political wedge issues designed to keep them afraid of the other. We're under a unitary federal government currently, and this is opposed to the case of the future national divorce. Is it currently preventing division, or is it currently stoking it so that these politicians on the opposite sides of the aisle can get themselves elected by saying they're less bad than the other guy? Because that's exactly what's happening. It's not, because the criticism, I think, isn't necessarily of national divorce, because I think this guy is getting it in his head that national divorce means Civil War II electric boogaloo. And that's what some people, not necessarily in the libertarian sphere, but in the conservative sphere, or conservative quote unquote sphere on the right, are talking about. But that's not what we're talking about at all. We want that peaceful separation so that the people can live their lives in a government that more sees what they see fit. Now, that government is still infringing on their rights. That government still is democratic and everything like that. But it's not an argument against national divorce, because that is still true within this federal government and still true of those individual state governments.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're even looking at it, beyond some more social issues, I mean, you could even kind of wrap in guns into that and say, okay, I mean, the government is stoking division based on, sort of firearm, violence that's happening. I mean, you could even say maybe they're promoting it a bit in certain areas, for people that are, struggling with some sort of mental issues. But no, I do think you can just turn away people that are so, passionate about the idea that guns need to be done away with in the hands of the citizens because of this violence. Do you think you can just get them to say, oh, you know what, actually, I will accept that I do need this, arm, and that everybody needs an arm to defend themselves against a tyrannical state? I just don't think you can bring people to that. So to kind of think as if we can, even issues that are somewhat less social and maybe a little more about, property, to even think that you can bring people to a point where they're all accepting the same values in a relatively short amount of time to oppose the state is just, to me, delusional.
Yeah, it's just and this goes into many other parts of theory, but we know that there are general predispositions towards political beliefs that are heritable, mostly from the work of Jonathan Haidt and whatnot, including people just value different things. There's differences of moral foundations. Libertarians are, and the most generous and nice way to put it is, mentally we are the most masculine out of any people, because we are really good at systematizing things and not caring about emotional appeals to emotion and stuff. People aren't necessarily like that. The other way to put it is that we're just autistic, because autistic individuals are this like most mentally masculine people, not necessarily physically. So the liberty movement's got like some problems they need to shape up a little bit. But when it comes to that, we can't just like use the autistic like libertarian ethics and everything like that and those arguments to appeal to everybody. Other people are just like more appealed to by some sort of like moral disgust. Some people are more appealed to like by fairness and stuff. So you are never going to get a message that will appeal to all people towards liberty. That just won't happen, especially to the people who are diehard authoritarians, who are a sizable amount, if not a majority, of the United States.
Yeah. So he goes on to, kind of state the obvious in the first sentence, but after that, there's a bit of a thing we could say about that. But okay, so he says the real political divide is not between red and blue states, but between rural and urban areas, which often have very different values and ways of living. Though in many ways they are opposites, they depend on each other materially. Libertarians provide an alternative to the current discourse by saying that we should not draw borders between people who disagree, but that we should draw borders between people and their government. Decentralization of power is a good thing. Decentralization of people banding together to restrict powers is a bad thing. So, yeah, I mean, he does correctly identify that it is between rural and urban areas most of the time, as opposed to red and blue states. But to that, I would say, why does national divorce have to be drawn at state borders? Who's to say that that is where people decide to split up, as opposed to areas that are more, at least, culturally homogenous when it comes to some of these issues, in their belief systems. And, and then going on the way that they depend on each other materially. I mean, you can make the case easily for that, but also who's to say that there's no sort of free agreement in trade between them, or at least a more, if there are borders, a more laxed border policy that makes it easier for commerce to happen between these organizations of people. So when he says libertarians provide an alternative to the current discourse by saying that we shouldn't draw borders between people who disagree, yeah, more so that's like the rules they're deciding to live under, as opposed to saying that it has to be that rights between these people to interact or their association ability is restricted.
I get that. It's like I'm trying to interact with your statement too, because I think he's just like fundamentally wrong about what a national divorce is, and it's like bringing that up, and I think we're going to bring it up again during the article, because when he's talking about like drawing borders between people who don't agree, you're right in that that's not what national divorce is, because the whole idea is that it's not about, hey, hate this person who no longer lives in your country or in your nation. It's the reason you are made to hate each other in this current nation is because you're both vying for power over everybody, and that's always going to be the case until we have national divorce. And when it's brought down to the smaller nation states, you're probably going to have the same problem over time where people are going to start disagreeing, and I think those people should have a similar national divorce.
And I've heard the argument that, hey, well, if we have a national divorce, that means that it's going to cause, the breaking up of even smaller portions of people. The libertarians are going to secede from the conservatives. And it's like, so that's kind of the point. Oh no, people can be free now. But for people that are against national divorce to even be saying that kind of clues you into the idea that this does set a precedent, and that it would be a lot easier to do it again after doing it the first time. So anyway, Jonathan goes on to say that let's see. So yeah, he says some say that people have the right to live with whatever gun, taxes, immigration laws they want, and that national divorce would reduce forced associations, he puts in quotes. But this is a wholesale rejection of libertarianism. That's his error, which believes that human rights are universal and must be protected. The idea that these new governments created by national divorce would obtain proper consent to take away individuals' rights is without evidence. Let's see. So, nor does the smaller voting population make it more acceptable to restrict people's rights. Libertarians completely reject the notion that when 51 out of 100 vote to take away your rights, it is more acceptable than 501 out of 1,000 voting to take away your rights. Your rights are yours, always. So, I mean, yeah, I do agree. I don't know why forced associations is in quotes, but
it's just scare quotes. It's just like, oh, these silly individuals talking about forced association. It means nothing.
Oh, they must automatically want to enact an ethno state in which, they oppress people that are different than them. Uh, anyway, but so he discusses whatever gun taxes, immigration laws they want. I mean, is that not better than them forcing their beliefs on us? Is that not a better system than saying that we will all send you to one building to discuss these things and come to some sort of resolution in which, we're always going to be forced to give up some of our values, at least, I mean, if not all, because there is no libertarian progress within Congress. There is no libertarian win if you're talking about the idea that the state doesn't have the right to impose taxation or any sort of aggression on me. We're never going to win that way if that's what you're saying, because to say that we should just send all these people to one building to discuss this means that there will be so many concessions that you wouldn't even recognize your libertarian society. It's just not going to happen. So I agree with the sentiment that your rights are yours always, but this is something I want to pass over to you, but if he's saying that, then wouldn't it seem that a representative government could never work?
I mean, yeah, and like it's so weird to see it from this guy because he's trying to appeal to like our ethics of like universality of rights and everything like that. So it's this sort of like advocacy for anything less than absolute protection of rights is anti-libertarianism. But what's the negation of the point of national divorce? Is that you ought not have a national divorce, which is the advocacy against protection of rights and everything like that. So it's so weird for him to take this position because he's advocating to stay in a larger democracy, which is a point against his statement about like the illegitimacy of 500 plus and 1 out of 1,000, which is so weird. Also so weird for this guy because he wrote an article why democracy is good for liberty recently. That is a more recent article than this one, so I guess he just completely forgot about this, but we're gonna be covering that. We better cover that.
Well, look, our system's different than that. We're just a democracy that happens to
Right.
work in our favor, and the majority could never oppress the minority. That just doesn't happen. It's no such cases.
And to point out like one more thing, the last sentence of the libertarian solution allows localization of choice for policies and leaders without removing the rights protections provided by the federal government. What's the federal government known for? Protecting human rights? I wouldn't say so. I'd say it's more known for violating them in terms of like the absolute catastrophes overseas, in home, just stealing your savings through the inflation of currency that it has the monopoly on, everything like that. So the idea that the federal government is this bastion of good in terms of liberty is an absolute joke.
Yeah, so he does say that, and he says, without removing the rights protections provided by the federal government. So is he, saying the Bill of Rights? Is he saying any rights that are enshrined in law? Does that include positive rights, or does it, are we solely discussing, the negative rights that are found within the Bill of Rights? Are we arguing against eminent domain, or are we just saying it's okay because it's in the Constitution, along with any other rights violations that are in there? And so, to what extent can the laws even be made when we're discussing negative rights in the first place, like on a local level? Like, why are we not saying that there's a federal government instead to enforce the NAP, like if that's the case? Like, what are you saying is a justifiable creation of policy at that point?
Yeah, it's the rejection of natural law for positive law, just like legislation created by the state. Ridiculous.
Yeah, and then he says it allows us to ensure that people, whatever their beliefs, may trade freely with each other, travel, buy and sell property, form contracts, speak freely, and every other thing consenting people who own themselves may do without harming others, all while being protected equally under the law. So that's kind of where it gets messy, because like he was just saying all of these things, form contracts freely, and all of these other things which could be handled easily and better, more efficiently, without the law imposing itself. But this is like sort of that like classical liberal globe emoji notion that if anything, a classical liberal world order, like a world government, would be preferable to small communities that are able to live the way they want.
Yeah, and it's just like so weird for him to say under that because he must have been living in Iraq for the past few centuries, living in Ancapistan in his head, because the Constitution gives the express power to regulate interstate commerce. We have a sales tax on nearly everything. The government dictates the terms of property sale in nearly every contract. And sure, you can speak freely in person, for the most part. If a cop doesn't try to abuse his power on tech platforms, they're going to lean on the tech platforms. The government will lean on the tech platforms to ban things under the threat of regulating them. So it's just absolutely ridiculous. And the most hilarious statement, I would say, is the remark about equality under the law. That while being protected equally under the law, I'd say I don't think we have that. I'd say the clients of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, I don't think they're having equal punishment under the law as any individual like civilian or anything like that. I'd say Obama not prosecuting Bush for war crimes just so he wouldn't also get prosecuted when he leaves is not the equal application under the law. But I guess none of them committed crimes because otherwise they'd be prosecuted because we have equality of the law, right? A civilian could just do that and wouldn't be charged?
You said he was
No.
living in Iraq, so you mean like he wants Sharia law?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like
I'm just pulling back to what you said earlier.
every single one. It's
No, but on a serious note, he's saying that libertarians should not be arguing for a national divorce with messages like people have a right to oppress themselves or they don't have a right to be free. We should be an unapologetic voice reminding people that natural rights are universal and are granted by no piece of paper or government. Well, libertarians offer the only non-authoritarian option where individual liberty is paramount, not the collected money and power of interest groups. Libertarianism is not pro-localized statism. It is a rejection of all statism. A national divorce leading to multiple separate fragments of a formerly United States would only further embolden authoritarians in the Democratic and Republican parties. So, no, wait a second. He's saying a rejection of all statism. So, like, why are you a classical liberal? Full
exactly.
stop. Like, why are you? Why? That doesn't make much sense. But saying that it'll embolden authoritarians in the Democratic and Republican parties, again, I mean, it's just going back to the idea, like, if you're saying it's going to embolden authoritarianism if there's a national divorce and this will be the whims of the majority in these places, I mean, it's almost as if there are like a number of people, like so overwhelmingly, that want to live this way, that perhaps centralizing them further is not the solution, or even keeping them the way they are now. Would it not make sense to break them apart so that at least their flavor of authoritarianism isn't imposed on somebody else? Like, is that not a preferable solution, even though it's not the best solution? I mean, is that not still preferable to now? If anything, split up the authoritarians, break away their, power to impose their will on 330 million people, or however, big America is at this point, to set the precedent that I don't have to live under their set of rules.
Right, and I'm gonna build off your point there, where I think you're even assuming too much from this guy. Because how would it embolden them? How would it embolden the authoritarians in the Democratic and Republican Party? Unless they're, like, outright calling to go to war between states and everything like that. There's no argument provided to how. You can only, like, assume. And, like, the primary way they get elected, that these people get elected, is because they point to the other guy, and they're just like, "This guy's more evil than I am. Vote for me." They can't do that anymore. There would be little to no other guy or people who would want to elect an other guy. And if there would, maybe that's another time for a national divorce. But going back to it, his whole thing of just like should not be arguing for national divorce with messages like people have the right to oppress themselves, they don't have a right to be free. Who's saying these statements? Who in the liberty movement advocating for national divorce is saying these statements? Maybe the conservatives, when they're just like, you get what you effing deserve. That sort of thing. When conservatives look at like the Black Lives Matter riots, the Summer of Love, and everything like that, and they're just like, you voted for these policies. No, there weren't a lot. The majority voted for those policies. The people in those cities who were the minority are still suffering under those policies. That's still unjust. It is better, however, for those same people who would vote for those policies to not affect people in other parts of the nation, in other parts of the territorial United States. And it's just a matter of just the utter like ignorance in the things that he's saying just like seconds before and seconds after. That's so baffling to me.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to be fair, on his statement as far as, they'll become more authoritarian, I think what he's trying to get at, whether he's right or wrong on it, is that there's going to be, forces in both areas that say, okay, now that we have the majority always, even though, they don't do much with that, right now, if you look at Florida or Texas. So it doesn't really point to this, but I'll try and give them a little bit of a leeway here with that. They'll say, okay, complete ban on abortion, for example, something like that. Or you'll see the blue areas be like complete ban on guns, So I think that's what he's trying to get at with this. Though, again, going to your point, yeah, he says literally at the beginning of the article that today many Americans aren't aren't motivated by the candidate they vote for, but rather fear of the candidate they are opposed to. So if there's not even that, if there's no sort of like making people afraid of the other, as he says, then why is it that these states would become more authoritarian than now? That actually is a really good point you made there. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll celebrate that, when it happens, but don't get too used to it.
I
Anyways,
should have had like a Chinese New Year popper or whatever.
yeah. Well,
I
just
got
buy
a compliment.
a little champagne for next time. But there is an argument to be had for secession, he says, but it must serve the purposes of protecting and advancing individual liberty. National divorce does the opposite. Our messaging should be a stark contrast to what the rest of the country is being told. As Republicans and Democrats focus on increasing the divisions and fear between Americans, libertarians have an opportunity to show America the best version of itself. A version of America held together by our common belief in the natural rights enumerated in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution that have survived for the last 2.5 centuries, while other countries around the world have dissolved or fallen apart. Wait a minute. Hold on. Okay, first of all, like first thing that popped out to me, because it's right away. There's an argument to be had for secession, but not national divorce. Look, if there's so much that all 50 states want to leave the union, we cannot have that. But if like one state wants to do it, then okay. Yeah. It's like, but we can't break apart the world police. Who knows what would happen?
It's just so weird because it's like it goes back to the same thing of him just like not understanding what national divorce is. I think he's staying on like the Chan too much or something like that, where he thinks national divorce is Civil War II, Electric Boogaloo. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that's just absolutely wrong, because national divorce is just secession on a larger state scale. Because like you could say it's just like you can have every single state split up. You can have 5 like groups of states split up in the federal government, whatever form that it takes. There are better arguments, more so about the logistical issues of it than on the fundamentals, because the fundamentals, as he points out in the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, which is not legally binding, says are betters, and the Constitution. In the Declaration of Independence, secession is enumerated, the right of groups to secede from whatever government, so long if that government is not achieving of the ends of protecting natural rights. That is enumerated as a natural right of man, because there are no group rights, there's only individual rights. So the individual has the right to secede. So it's just a weird matter of things, and you were going to talk.
You're not thinking about this logically. This guy probably reveres Lincoln. Like, so to say that, he's thinking that, the Declaration of Independence should be taken wholesale. Well, I don't know about all that, and also he's basically implying also that the Constitution should be taken wholesale as well. I just wonder if he contests any of the ideas, as far as, violations of natural rights, because there are natural rights enumerated in the Constitution, though not all together consistently. There are inconsistencies with it. So to say that this is something we should uphold along with the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't seem very much like he's read the entirety of them. I don't know. but also, like, I suppose what I'm saying with that is that, like, he understands the precedent that came with them. He understands how the government was centralized with the Constitution. He understands how Lincoln, I'm sure, did what he did. But then that would mean that he rejects some of the ideas.
He does not know that sort of stuff. But
sure, but I'm not saying he necessarily like knows, oh, Lincoln was a tyrant. But I'm saying, like, he knows Lincoln upheld the Union in a sense, and like, took out his political opponents to do that, So the whole thing, I don't know. You don't think he knows that Lincoln arrested people without habeas corpus? Like, I don't know. I feel like that's at least, that, even if you're like, oh, well, it was right because of the time or whatever.
Yeah. Counterpoint. he still
Okay.
believes in equality under the law. So
See,
there's
it's just not all too consistent. I mean, like I know I'm pulling a bit out more than what he's saying, so like I don't want to like make any assertions about what he actually believes. But the thing is if you look at what he's saying when he says these things, it just doesn't make it so consistent that I can agree with him on these points. Like, how can I agree with you on, upholding natural rights or saying that like, we're going to advance individual liberty when you're also saying that, this is just going to be even more statist than a place we're in right now. And that, it's not going to help individual rights whatsoever. Like, what is your solution other than somehow incentivize the federal government, which it has no reason to be, but limiting itself? Like, what do you think this guy's solution is? Like, how does he get to, a limited federal government?
I mean, I guess that'll have to wait for next podcast when we go over his or a later podcast when we go over his democracy article. But I just want to like focus on one thing of him saying like our message should be in stark contrast to what the rest of the country is being told. Are they being told about national divorce? Is that being encouraged? Or is the establishment either uncaring about it or they are firmly against it? Is the mainstream media like promoting it? Maybe a little bit in terms of like, oh, we're going to have a Cal exit. If Trump wins, California is going to secede and stuff like that. No one's taking that seriously. I wish they did. I wish they would take that seriously.
They're promoting civil war more than anything. They are trying to push that more than anything. And you even have Bill Gates saying that he thinks the next election is going to be like contested based, but that also that it's just going to lead to like nobody accepting the results in if it's not in their favor. And but as far as the awareness of secession and all of that, there are polls to suggest that actually there are at least a significant, I would say, amount of people that do want this, because I actually, mentioned this in my article. There was a September 2021 poll from the UVA Center for Politics that found that 52% of Trump and 41% of Biden voters at least somewhat agree that it's time to split the country, favoring blue-red states seceding from the union. And there was actually like a graph I put in my, thing from that. And it basically just explains the different regions of the United States and their support for balkanizing their area in the sense of like leaving the United States just without, the rest of the country doing so necessarily. But I don't know. Overall, like, in this guy's views, it just seems like it comes back to that, like, and you'll get the reference. I assume people would, but, we heard him speak at Rev. Justin Amash, him talking about how the Constitution is the greatest document and that, it's upholding our rights and that without it, we would fall into chaos, that without it, there would be so much more statism, that this is the only thing holding the government back, that for some reason the federal government is still respecting it, even though we have red flag laws, Patriot Act, no-knock warrants, and a lot of other things. I mean, like, but he's they both and a lot of people that are of this idea come to the notion that without this document we would fall into tyranny and that there is no better way of facilitating things, that the only thing we can do from here is limit the federal government to what they call its basic necessities. And that could even mean, some form of limited versions of what we have now. I mean, if you're talking about like, okay, if we're going to like what a conservative, conservative, like Joe Walsh believes what a limited government is, because he was thinking about joining the Libertarian Party back when it was this rhetoric. He was saying recently, though, that the FBI is enforcing the law legitimately when it came to their, raid on Trump and Mar-a-Lago and whatever you believe on that event. I'm just saying, like, he was backing up the FBI as a legitimate institution in his view. That's what I'm trying to get at with that. Like, he, as a limited government conservative, is like, oh yeah, the FBI has a perfectly normal function in our society and they uphold the law and that's perfectly legitimate. And for that kind of person to be thinking like before the Mises Caucus take over to join the Libertarian Party says a lot about where these people were before the takeover and where, classical liberals are in their beliefs to a great degree.
Yeah, because I think like when it comes to like, oh, we should just return to the Constitution talk and everything like that, you gotta know that there's like, just like say the preamble, promote general welfare. That is just a blank check to any tyrant to just expand and expand and expand and expand because, oh, we're promoting the general welfare. It's almost like the Constitution also doesn't really protect fundamental rights that shall not be infringed. I don't know what it said shall not be infringed, but surely that hasn't been infringed since the founding of the country, or surely the Constitution stopped it. Or you cannot be a witness to yourself surely in no regard does the government make you be a witness to yourself, for instance, just pulling it out of thin air, in making you report your income to a federal agency so that it can convict you for tax fraud if you didn't. It's an absolute joke. It has the best thing that I can say about the Constitution is that Bill of Rights exists. It's done some things, if only for like the tradition and like individuals in the federal government and whatnot, earn some legitimacy when they respect the tradition, so they have that incentive to. But in the structuring of America, in what is called a federalist style, but what can be used instead to create a more localist style of government, which goes towards the decentralization, where in this system, in a localist system, you'd have a easier time of earning liberty, which I would say is a pro-liberty position, when you only have to convince 51 out of 100 people instead of 100 million out of 200 million active voters, or not active voters, but like however many million people who vote in elections. That's an easier job that gets more liberty for more people on that individual level. And it's the way forward. And this guy's just like, no, you can't do that because that's not protection of rights. That isn't the immediate protection of all rights. Absolutely. Instead, go to this federal government where we'll never win. We'll never pick up more than like 5% of the vote. And then just wait. Liberty will happen. We just got to educate more people.
I wonder what his response would be to the idea that if there were a federal government, it would just literally oversee the ability of people to secede from the government if they so please, or like join their own preferable, like, sort of, community or whatever, without the fact that like, they're violating rights or whatever. Take that out of it, out of the equation. But basically to say that, like, does he think the federal government, could just enforce the non-aggression principle? No, I don't think so. I don't think he'd agree to that. But, so then that comes to the idea, like, if he doesn't, I'm not going to say necessarily he doesn't, but that's what I'm taking from this. Then he does not believe that, property rights are actually supposed to be a right that people have to its fullest extent, that, you don't actually have a right to disassociate from an entity that is aggressing on your rights, and that you don't have the ability to voluntarily agree to rules that you live by. So like, I mean, if you're talking about like covenant communities or something like that, that there is no right to do such a thing. I don't know. I mean, like, does he think that if there's no democracy involved, that if it does come down to people voluntarily living under a set of rules, that's different? I mean, it is, but I'm just wondering if in his view, any of this would be viable, or like something that could actually be used to advance liberty, or does he just see it as not legitimate?
I mean, like, I'd say that's a really good question, because it goes back to like one of his statements of people have a right to oppress themselves. Well, people don't, because there's no such thing as people. There's just individuals. Does an individual have a right to oppress themselves? Yeah. They have a right to enter into a contract that restricts their right in some way, so long as it's a transfer of property, because that's what a contract is. So, like, entering into a work relationship with the boss, if part of that stipulation is you can't work for someone else, you've limited your liberty. This guy might say you don't have a right to oppress yourself, but I think it's in this case, I think he might say, okay, well, the individual does, but people do not have a right to oppress other subset of other individuals of that subset people, and that's right. But that is not a matter that is still true whether or not there's a national divorce. Unless one of those things becomes a monarchy, then it's just a different sort of way, in the same sort of fashion of restricting rights. But I don't think any monarchies coming. I don't think that's relevant to the conversation. Just threw that in there to throw them a bone.
But have you considered the fact that natural rights are universal and are granted by no piece of paper, but that our government's going to be fixed by a piece of paper?
Yeah. Because it gets back to idiom, heard it repeated 1,000 times, of just the Constitution was either powerless in stopping the federal government to getting to where it was today, or it led us here. It got us to get here. And I think that goes back to like Lysander Spooter.
Yeah, it is him. That is him.
Yeah.
He did say that whatever the Constitution is, I don't have the exact quote, but I'm paraphrasing to the best of my ability, that this is clear that it either was unable or I guess suppose like it was not written in the sense of that it could stop what is happening today, or that it simply was unable to stop it. And in either scenario, it is not fit of a
It
document to
is,
be
yeah.
a governing document. Yeah, I kind of like obviously I don't have the exact phrase in my head, but that is the
Yeah.
sentiment that he expressed there.
Yeah. So because this guy, he wants democracy. He wants to have deference towards a federal government to protect rights, even though everything in the past 250 years of this United States stand together has been an increase of authoritarianism in the federal government. Just ignore that. Just like if we educate enough people, they'll avoid otherwise. So I guess this gets into a general discussion of just like, what is the end goal? What is the alternative to that system of how we achieve liberty? And I'll ask you, I know my way of doing it, but I'll ask you, what do you think?
I will say that when it comes to convincing as many people as possible, I think we'll have to get into this when we discuss his views on democracy. I would say the reason it seems that he believes that democracy would work is that you can convince a majority. But even as Emma Goldman said, the majority cannot reason. It's not fit to be this governing entity of people or individuals. I mean to say, but ultimately it's a flawed system. It's obviously tyrannical. There's just no way in which you could involuntarily impose this on people and then say, hey, okay, so now basically either everything, all of your rights, or even some of your property rights are now up to the whims of half these people and then another guy. So, but when it comes to actually solving the problem, no, I mean, it doesn't come down to voting. Obviously it's good to have this sort of discussion in which you're saying, people should be living their own lives in the way they wish. National divorce is a better way to achieve that than most of the other solutions that you could propose right now. National divorce is basically like if we're fortunate, that's what we get. It's as opposed to any sort of tension that keeps boiling right now and perhaps leading to this sort of conflict that could be a civil war. Ultimately, it is that I see it as individuals must in order to preserve their liberty, live the way that they want to, using their property and not aggressing on other people's rights. Like we have an opportunity right now, especially with the scope of the state. It's not the point where we couldn't oppose it with by exercising our property rights and essentially like doing things that are within perhaps black markets, and you can get into agorism and all that with that, but essentially just being free today is one of the best ways you can oppose the state. I mean, like they'll probably go out and shoot you if you try living in the woods, but if you can figure out a way to live more off the grid and be more self-reliant and keep your transactions out of the scope of and I'll try to keep it a little bit safe with that, but keep your transactions out of the scope of the IRS. But ultimately I think that is a much preferable way right now to at least do something about the issues. You could get into other theories of how that could happen. Perhaps one is also a cultural thing, getting into the idea that yes, a culture, like a leading culture, will sort of have people coalesce to it rather than just like convincing people individually. And especially if you have like the people who are more powerful backing that, you can definitely get into a territory where you are going to be a lot more successful with it.
Yeah, and gonna comment on agorism. There's something weird about like I don't know the entire history, but there's like a weird almost rejection of the specialization of labor and agorism. I think that goes back to like more left-wing economics, because you could have your gray markets, you could have your black markets. You're never going to have an agorist car factory. Anything at a certain level of scale is always going to be like found by the government, just like, what's this? A smoothie. You're going to have that problem of like hiding those transactions. And in the agorist like sort of world, the more you can produce yourself or like have your own capital goods, like isolating yourself as an individual, so you make less transactions that could be found by the state, the better. Um, but I would say it's a sort of thing where any sort of agorist success would be at like the acquiescence of the state, which secession would have to be too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'd say there's other ways to do it. I'm going to present a sort of way of just like the localism that I was talking about, where you could have you can use the democratic process defensively in defense of property rights. When you get elected to a local position, you could privatize everything as much as possible. Now, there's a way to privatize it that is as just as possible, and there's a way to privatize it that is not as just as possible. Not as just as possible is just saying, "Hey, I own this now as an individual." That'd be sort of like the Nazi sort of way of privatization, just
Or
like we're
selecting
gonna,
a corporation that would take
yeah,
over.
yeah. Amazon now owns this town and these roads, or McDonald's owns the roads now. You can drive on your Mick roads and follow your Mick speed limit.
Yeah, and I will say that Puerto Rico, they privatized their power grid, but essentially they just handed over to a
Yeah,
company.
yeah,
And then I do have family there, but the whole point that I would hear is that, oh, well, it was more efficient when it was the state doing it, and what I'm saying is that it's still an illegitimate monopoly, that there is no
yeah,
competition to solve the issue there in the first place.
yeah. Because monopolies in a market context or economic context are only brought about through state grants. So when you have, say, just like that instance, you have the state have these private companies join the anti-productive class. In Austrian class theory, as opposed to Marxist class theory, it's made up of the productive, where you have producers, homesteaders, who just like the people who acquire items from nature or natural resources, and you have traders. They make up the economy. They are what makes the economy grow and flourish and everything like that, and brings the price of consumer and capital goods all the way down, for further growth. And then you have the anti-productive class. You have the state, which it produces, instead of goods, they produce bads. They produce taxation, theft, extortion, everything like that. And in any individual or association that advocates or petitions for the expropriation of property from the productive class is the anti-productive class, along with the state. They make their economic gains not through economic means, but through political means in association with the state. And such private organizations are state associated, state almost state run, to make it almost idiocy to say that they are parts of the private market. They're part of the free market.
So going back to what you were saying with, sort of the way to get away from government, what would you say then is the method to legitimately and most efficiently, I would say, transfer that those resources and that are not legitimately in the hands of this anti-productive class toward the society in general?
Okay. I would say it is covered, and this is where I get most of my inspiration from, in Hans Hermann Hoppe's What Must Be Done. And the general gist is 3-4 part strategy of: first, you must restrict the voting rights of welfare recipients, government employees, everything like that, to increase taxes on property. And the key thing with that is they have the incentive, of course, to increase it, because they are the individuals that benefit most from it, because they're direct welfare recipients of the government. They receive those resources back from the state through that policy of distributionism. So when
You're
you
telling me we
have
can't stop them from voting in general?
only on the increase in property rights in this certain case, you can't necessarily and stopping them from, say, voting on like social policy or anything like that is not really a matter of what makes this so effective. And the votes of the property owners should be in proportion to the amount of property that they own. The person who owns $100,000 versus worth of property's vote is going to be less than the person who owns $1 million worth of property. And we're talking about individuals here that stay here, not corporations. Corporations are not individuals and everything like that. At most, they're associations. And that gets into the whole fucking Citizens United or anything like that people like to bring up, and is a discussion that can happen at a later time. But from that, you get the general principle of those taxes on that property were lower because said individuals don't want higher taxes on their property. They want lower taxes. So over time, there would be a debt crisis of the local government there. And the way out of the debt crisis is to reduce spending. How do you reduce spending? You can, and I forget precisely if it's sell off or just distribute um, the publicly owned property in shares to the individuals of that community. And the amount of shares distributed would be in proportion to lifetime taxes paid, because after all, they paid for it, they own it. Um, and those shares could be traded individually like that. In that sort of system, it would be um, not privately owned yet in any sense that it would be owned by like one individual. It would be owned like a joint stock company or whatever. So it would have problems that would then have the market solve it out, where these people still want the fire department. So you'd have the individuals who are most property owners who already engage in charitable action or anything like that to either create a business of it, sell it off to someone else to create a business of it, like sell their shares. I'm not interested in this. Or they would charitably create that themselves and providing those services themselves. And by that point, you've already had the privatization of all the land. The property is already owned. So you would have no infringements on property rights, seeing as all property rights, all rights are property rights. You would have no infringements from that local government.
All right. Well, to wrap that up, basically, national divorce is a preferable solution to what this guy is saying, Jonathan, and what we're saying here is a preferable solution to what Jonathan is saying when he says democracy is the ultimate solution. Nevertheless, I don't think he's going to win in the end with his continued centralization of the federal government.
Last I checked, the what is it called? The Libertarian Party Classical Liberal Caucus isn't necessarily in power. I think some different guys are in charge now.
Well, we'll see. I don't know who these guys
We'll
are, but anyway, we'll wrap it up here. Think that was a pretty solid conversation. Next time we'll likely be talking about Jonathan Casey's, and we'll see how much we bully this guy. But we'll likely be talking about his democracy article and why it's, in his view, so good. By the way, again, my name is Ahmed Mlih. I have a website called ahmedmlih.com and also have a Substack for Civil Offense, civiloffense.substack.com. Please feel inclined to subscribe to my email lists and, support me in any way you can. This has been Civil Offense. Ashton, do you have anything to close with?
I'm just going to say that I'm a little boy who didn't do nothing. Federal agents, please don't investigate me.
I really think if you eat a cheeseburger in your car that you're going to have a cop pull up to it, open the door, and start blasting.
So long as I don't have a car that can be confused with someone else. I don't know if he actually was the one that he was chasing after. You saw
he wasn't the one he was actually,
That's
no.
worse.
And by the way,
So
there was a cop that, blasted a kid who, he was confusing the kid with a different car that had been evading him before. But also, if you're evading a cop, that's not a death sentence. That's not the reason for the cop to open your property without your consent and then start shooting you. But anyway, again, this has been Civil Offense. And remember that civil offense is the key to winning. Thank you.